while the wind brushes past the window. I'm glad you're here. Tonight's story isn't about victory or glory. It's about silence, the slow unraveling of a world. So dim the lights if you haven't already. Turn on a fan if you like the hush of wine in the background. Maybe even close your eyes if it helps the words feel closer. And if you find comfort in these gentle journeys through time, feel free to subscribe or leave a little note in the comments. Tell us where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Now, take a slow breath. The past is waiting. Our story begins not with a bang, but with a sigh, as the Western Roman Empire began its final century of life. You'd hardly call it an empire anymore. By the late 4th century, the edges had frayed. The roads that once sang with the rhythm of marching boots were growing quiet. The mosaics cracked, the stones grew cold, but not all at once. There were still dinners being prepared in smoky kitchens, voices calling out in marketplaces, children playing with little clay dolls beside ivy-covered walls. Rome was dying, but it didn't look like death, not yet. It looked like forgetting, like weeds slowly overtaking marble, like a candle flickering in a breeze that hasn't quite arrived. In the countryside, where the golden fields of grain stretched far under gray and violet skies, farmers bent over their plows with one hand always near a weapon. Their ears were tuned not to birdsong or the rustle of olive trees, but to the distant clang of hooves, wondering if the next sound would bring death or demands. It was a time when you didn't ask if trouble would come, only when. The Pax Romana, that long, golden piece of the early empire, was a ghost now. People still spoke its name with reverence, like a lullaby passed down from grandparents who had seen the world at its peak. But for the average Roman now, whether in the highlands of Gaul or the narrow alleys of Ravenna, it was just a memory they never personally owned. Cities like Rome, once thunderous with crowds, had grown eerily quiet. The great heart of the empire, once pumping life to every corner of the Mediterranean, was faltering. At its peak, 1 million souls had moved through its stone arteries, but now, maybe 30,000 remained, wandering under half-lit archways and broken statues. The sound of the Tiber flowed louder than the streets. Even the gods seemed to have withdrawn. Temples stood hollow, offerings left to rot. People still prayed, of course, to Jupiter, to Mars, to Christ, depending on the household, but the prayers felt thinner. Less confident. There's a certain weight to belief when your world is intact. But when your roof leaks, your fields fail, and your empire crumbles, how long do you keep waiting for an answer? On the northern frontiers, the old Roman legions were shadows of what they once were. Gone were the elite soldiers who marched with iron discipline, bearing the eagle standards of Rome. In their place stood half-trained men from distant lands, paid little, fed poorly, their loyalty only as firm as the next paycheck. They wore Roman armor, yes, but it fit like borrowed clothes. And when the Germanic tribes pressed against the border, many of them simply walked away. Back home, the elite sealed themselves inside their fortified villas, thick walls, guarded gates. They looked out across crumbling towns and saw not neighbors, but threats. What wealth remained was hoarded, gold buried beneath cellars, silver traded in whispers. No one trusted the coinage anymore. Inflation gnawed at the economy like rats in a granary. You could carry a sack of coins to the baker and still not have enough for bread. And yet, life went on. There were still births and weddings. People still laughed, still told stories, still planted seeds and hoped they would grow. That's the strange thing about collapse. It doesn't always look like fire and ruin. Sometimes it's just an extra creak in the floorboards. A letter that never arrives, a neighbor who vanishes without a word. One such place, quiet, remote, and long overlooked, lay nestled in the hills of northern Italy. A small town, once a stop along a bustling trade route, now barely a whisper on the map. Its forum overgrown with grass, its bathhouse dry. A few families remained, old names, old blood, tending what was left. Among them, a woman named Licinia, a name barely remembered by history. But in her time, she watched the world fade like smoke from a blown-out candle. She wasn't a noble. Not a priestess or a scholar. Just the daughter of a baker and a washerwoman. She had a soft voice, rough hands, and eyes like storm clouds, always watching the horizon. Her family had once baked bread for the local garrison. Good bread, too dense, crusted with sesame, the kind that made soldiers smile for a moment and think of home. But the garrison was gone now. The fort had been looted, its stones carted off for someone's private wall. The kiln in her father's shop hadn't burned hot in weeks, but Licinia still rose before dawn each day. Still swept the dust from the steps, still folded cloth over the loaves they no longer made. Why? Because some part of her believed that maybe, just maybe, it would matter. That one day, someone would come. That the smell of bread might return. That Rome might not be truly gone. Hope, even in collapse, is a stubborn ember. Outside the town, the road curved toward the foothills where vines clung to the rocks and wolves had begun to return. What used to be a guarded post was now just a marker stone, half fallen. Travelers passed less and less, and when they did, they never stayed long. Merchants no longer trusted the roads. The risks outweighed the profits. A wagon of goods could vanish in a night, and so the town, and Licinia with it, began to fold inward. Letters from the capital stopped arriving. The price of salt doubled. The mayor's son was conscripted, never seen again, and still. The seasons turned. It was in the bitter chill of late autumn that the first fires were seen on the distant ridges. Not wildfires. Torches. A slow-moving band of something, no one knew quite what. Word spread quickly, as it does in small places. Families packed what they could. Some left, hoping to reach the coast. Others stayed, clutching old blades, praying to forgotten gods. Licinia stood on the roof of her crumbling bakery and watched the flickering lights inch closer each night. She didn't speak of it, just watched and waited. Collapse, after all, is not a single event. It is a collection of quiet decisions. Stay or go, fight or yield. Light the oven or let it go cold. And in the silence between those choices, history is written. The fires never came close, not then. They danced along the far ridge for days, a slow, flickering procession just beyond reach. At night, they lit the clouds with an amber hue. During the day, smoke curled like fingers into the gray autumn sky, too distant to smell, too near to forget. Licinia watched them, every evening, from the slanted rooftop of the bakery. The tiles were loose beneath her. One had slid 3 weeks ago in a storm, but she didn't mind. It was the quietest place in the village now, up above the whirring, the rumors, the prayers muttered too loudly in the streets below. Up here, it was only wind, stone, and the soft crackle of distant flame. There had once been music in the streets, lutes and flutes, the clink of amphorae, children chasing goats through the square. Now, there was only the groan of shutters swinging loose and the dry rattle of leaves scratching across empty roads. The town had grown quiet in a way that felt hollow. The silence of departure. Those who could leave had, within days of the fires being seen, the wealthier families, the ones with horses, carriages, and coin, slipped away. Not in one panicked mass, but carefully, quietly. Some left at dawn, their wagons loaded with silks and spices. Others crept out at dusk, barely a whisper between footsteps. They said little to those left behind, just a glance, a nod, an unspoken admission that they were no longer part of this place. The mayor locked his home and nailed a note to the door. No one read it. His house stood empty, shutters drawn, windows dark. Licinia stayed. Why? Perhaps because she had nowhere else to go. But more than that, she belonged to the bones of the town. Her family had lived here for 3 generations. They were buried just beyond the olive grove, beneath flat stones and dry grass. Leaving would have meant leaving them behind, and what was a life without memory? Each morning she swept the steps of the bakery, though no customers came. She kept the counters clean, checked the grain, now mostly gone. Sometimes she lit a fire in the hearth, just to hear the crackling, to remember the way her father used to hum while kneading dough. Memory, in times like these, became a kind of prayer. Not everyone had gone. A few remained. Old Petronius, the blacksmith, who no longer had tools to mend but still sat beside his cold forge, eyes red from smoke or sleep or both. The widow Valeria, who wandered the square each morning murmuring to herself, clutching her husband's old army cloak. 2 young boys, twins, who spent their days gathering fallen branches and watching the horizon. No one knew where their mother had gone. They didn't speak much, those who remained. But they looked at each other differently now, not as strangers, but as survivors. As the last, one evening, just as the sun dropped behind the hills and cast the town in violet shadow, the bells rang. No one had touched them in weeks. They hung above the chapel, rusted, dull, heavy with silence. But on that night, They moved. Once, then again. A deep, mournful toll that echoed down the empty lanes and into the marrow of every listening soul. Licinia froze in her stairwell, hand still on the railing. Valeria screamed, one short cry that ended in silence. The boys ran. Petronius sat up straight and grabbed the rusted blade he kept behind the door. No one had pulled the rope. The wind, perhaps. Or something else. They gathered in the chapel that night, the few who remained. Not for mass, the priest had fled days ago, but because it was the only place that still felt sacred. Stone and oak, a roof that didn't leak. A place where candles still burned, if you brought your own. They didn't speak of the bells. Instead, they sat, close, but not touching, breathing the same cold air. Letting the silence stretch out between them like a blanket, there was comfort in shared presence. Even without words, after a while, Licinia stood and lit the altar flame. Not because she believed it would change anything, but because some part of her couldn't bear to see the chapel dark. Later, as they stepped out beneath the sky smeared with stars, the fires on the hills had gone. No light. No smoke, nothing. The next morning, they found the old road to the north churned with hoof prints and cart wheels, fresh, deep, and heading away. The threat had passed. Or moved on. Still, the mood didn't lift. Relief was a brittle thing in those days. Every kindness felt temporary. Every calm, a prelude. They had survived one wave. That didn't mean the sea had stilled. Winter crept in slow, like a dog with a limp. The days shortened. The air thickened. Rain returned, not heavy, but cold, constant, the kind that seeped into stone and stayed. The bakery's hearth stayed lit longer now, even without bread. Sometimes Licinia would boil roots, or dried lentils, and leave the bowl on the doorstep. For the boys, she said, though she never saw them take it. One day, she found a single pine cone left in return. Balanced carefully on the stone ledge. And so, winter came, with small gestures and quiet rituals. But the empire didn't come back. No tax collector. No courier. No soldiers. No letters. It was as if the thread had been cut and they were drifting, unmoored, in a sea of forgotten land. The strange thing was, life didn't stop. The trees still shed their leaves. The wind still howled down the passes. The moon rose, full and pale, as always. Nature cared nothing for the fall of empires. It watched, patient, unmoved. Licinia began writing letters. She had no one to send them to, not really, but she wrote them anyway. In a careful, curling script on scraps of old parchment, she wrote to her father, long gone. To her brother, taken by the plague when she was a child. To her future self. To no one. They were filled with small things. The smell of whetstone after rain, the sound of birds nesting in the rafters, the way Petronius cried one morning and pretended it was from the smoke. I want someone to remember, she wrote, even if it's just words left in a drawer. In the broader empire, such as it still existed, cities burned. Visigoths crossed the Alps. Vandals swept through Africa. Whole regions fell silent. But here, in this town without a name, a woman lit her hearth, watched the stars, and remembered how to be human. The snow came late that year, not in flurries, not in a storm, just a quiet falling, like ash from an unseen fire. It drifted down at dawn, coating rooftops in a soft, white hush, no fanfare, no warning. By morning, the town was buried under a blanket of silence that seemed to stretch all the way to the edge of the world. Licinia stood in the doorway of the bakery and watched it fall. The oven hadn't been lit in days. There was no grain left, no honey, no yeast. Just a few salted olives in a clay jar and a cracked cup of lentils, but the fire still crackled in the hearth. She kept it going not for food, but for the sound, for the flicker, for the way it reminded her that something was still alive in the bones of this house. She wrapped her shawl tighter, breathing in the sharp sting of winter air, and stepped into the snow barefoot. It was a ritual she'd learned from her mother, to greet the first snowfall in silence. No words, just skin to snow, heart to sky, as though offering your presence to the season might earn you its mercy. The town had shrunk even more. 3 more families had vanished during the long, gray stretch of November, leaving behind shuttered doors and empty homes where voices used to live. No one said goodbye anymore. They simply disappeared, like smoke through the cracks. Only 6 people remained now. Petronius, who rarely left his forge except to gather wood. Valeria, who grew quieter with each passing week. The twin boys, wild-eyed and sharp, more shadow than flesh these days. A girl named Aaliyah, barely 13, whose parents had fled south and never returned. And Licinia. They didn't speak often. There were no gatherings now, no shared meals. But sometimes, they crossed paths in the falling snow. A glance, a nod, a simple, shared understanding that we are still here. And sometimes, that was enough. The world beyond the hills remained a mystery. No word came from the north, no messengers from Ravenna, no imperial decrees. The road that led to the nearest outpost had become a path of footprints, quickly swallowed by snow. The old markers along the route had toppled. Time, like the Empire, was crumbling. But in the quiet, something strange began to happen. Licinia started to hear voices. Not ghosts, not quite. More like memories rising in the stillness. Her father's low laugh echoing in the empty oven. Her mother's footsteps pacing the upstairs hall. The creak of her brother's bed when he rolled over in the night. They came not as fear, but as company, familiar, soft, as if the house itself remembered what it meant to be full. One night, she dreamed of Rome. Not the Rome of stories, not the marble palaces or grand arenas, but a narrow street in Trastevere, where her aunt used to live. She saw it clearly, the cracked basin in the courtyard, the way sunlight pulled on the mosaic floor, the scent of warm bread and lemon all. When she woke, the memory stayed with her, so vivid it brought tears. She hadn't been to Rome in 20 years. Was it still there? Had the Tiber overflowed its banks? Were the statues still standing? She didn't know. The empire was fading, but memory. Memory lingered like perfume in an empty room. In late December, the snow turned to ice. Trees bent under its weight, roofs groaned. The town creaked like an old ship in a frozen sea. The well began to freeze at the edges, and the wind howled through broken shutters like a voice trying to speak. One morning, Licinia found footprints outside the bakery. They weren't hers, not the boys, not Petronius or Valeria. Larger, heavier, a man's boots, lined with fur. 3 sets of them, coming from the woods, stopping at her door. Then turning back, she didn't panic, didn't scream. Just stood there for a long time, watching the marks slowly fill with snow. Wondering. The next night, she lit every candle she had and placed them in the window. A signal. Or a warning. They stayed lit until dawn. The tracks didn't return. In the weeks that followed, more signs appeared. Trees cut down at the edge of the grove. A rabbit, skinned and left hanging from a hook near the well, not the boys' work. A low hum of voices in the early morning, drifting down from the hills. Whoever they were, they hadn't come into town. Not yet. Licinia spoke to Petronius for the first time in weeks. They stood under the chapel's archway, snow drifting around them like dust in a forgotten room. "They're watching us," he said. His voice was thin, not afraid, just tired. Licinia nodded. "Let them watch. What do we do?" She looked out toward the woods, toward the flicker of trees shivering in the cold. "We stay," she said, "until we can." That night, she sat by the fire and wrote again. 0 Not to her family this time, but to anyone. To the one who finds this, she wrote. "We were still here, even when the world forgot us. We remembered the names. We kept the hearths burning. We whispered to the stars. We lived, even when the empire fell quiet." She folded the letter and placed it under a loose floorboard, alongside the others. Over 20 now, each one a heartbeat. A trace. By early January, the ice began to thaw. Not completely, just enough to see the earth again. Enough to feel that strange, aching thing that always came with the turn of the season. Hope, fragile, foolish, but real. The empire was a memory. The world had shifted. But somewhere, far beyond the hills, spring was coming. And in this little forgotten town, half broken, half buried, someone still waited for the first green bud to appear on the branch. The thaw brought sound back. It began as a drip. Soft, subtle, a single note falling from the roof's edge, landing in the muddy snow below. Then another, and another, like the ticking of some ancient clock long stilled and suddenly remembering how to breathe. By the end of the week, the village was full of it, the sigh of ice surrendering to sun, the trickle of melting frost racing down gutters, the crack of frost split wood settling back into shape. Even the crows, long absent, returned to the boughs with their harsh voices, as though protesting the cold's retreat. For a while, it felt like the world was waking up. But with spring came change, and not all of it welcome. Licinia noticed it first, a scent in the wind, not fire, not rot. Something more metallic, more human, the kind of smell that clings to weapons, to sweat, to leather left too long in the rain. She said nothing at first, just watched the tree line more closely, kept the door barred, even in daylight. Reinforced the bakery's shutters with strips of old wood and rusted nails. The others followed her lead without asking why. They all felt it, eventually. A tension in the air, like the moment before thunder. The roads remained empty. No caravans, no traders. No word from the Empire, as if it had stopped breathing entirely. But the feeling that something was near crept in like mold beneath the walls. One evening, just before dusk, Valeria vanished. She had been seen that morning, walking the narrow path between her home and the chapel, as she did every day. Wrapped in that same threadbare cloak, a small bundle of herbs in her hand. Her lips moving with prayer. By nightfall, her home was cold. Her hearth dead, her bed undisturbed. There was no blood. No signs of struggle. Just absence. The boys found her shoes in the woods the next day, carefully placed beneath a cedar tree, facing north. They did not speak for 2 days after. Petronius wept quietly in the forge. Licinia didn't cry. She had no tears left. Just questions. Cold, heavy questions that lodged in the chest like stones. Had Valeria wandered off? Had someone taken her? Had she chosen to disappear? Was this what death looked like now? Quiet, unceremonious, a vanishing act performed in silence. The old ways, the Roman rites, the offerings, the carefully spoken words over graves, they no longer seemed to matter. There was no priest, no pyre, no coin for the ferryman. Just snowmelt, cold stone, and a name that no one would speak aloud again. The wind changed. Aaliyah was the one who saw them. She burst into the bakery at dusk, cheeks flushed from running, eyes wild. There in the fields, she whispered. Licinia dropped the bowl she was holding. It shattered on the stone floor, lentils scattering like bones. She didn't ask who. She didn't need to. By the time they reached the top of the old hill, the one where the vineyards used to bloom, the sun had dropped below the horizon, and the field beyond was cast in pale twilight. Figures moved along the far edge. 7, maybe more. Not soldiers, not bandits. Men wrapped in cloaks and iron, their shoulders broad, their heads shaven or bound in cloth. One carried a banner, black, torn, unmarked. Another had a spear taller than himself. They did not speak, did not cross the field. They watched. And then, slowly, turned back into the woods. No one slept that night. Licinia sat by the fire with a blade across her lap. She had not held a weapon since her brother taught her to throw rocks at passing birds in childhood, but the feel of cold iron was a strange comfort. Petronius took shifts at the chapel, a rusted axe in his hand. The boys curled near the forge, one of them clutching a slingshot, the other holding a kitchen knife too big for his hand. Aaliyah sang softly in the corner, not a song of comfort, but of warning. A wordless hum passed down from mother to daughter, and darker times. It rained. Hard, cold, the kind of rain that washed away tracks, blurred edges, drowned footsteps. And when morning came, the field was empty again, but the fear remained. That week, Licinia began digging, behind the bakery, in the soft earth near the wall. She didn't tell the others why. Maybe she didn't know herself. Maybe she just needed to feel the weight of earth in her hands. To prepare something, anything, a garden, a grave, a memory. The soil was damp, black, full of roots and pebbles. She planted nothing, but she kept digging. One morning, while the sun was still low, she found a coin, small, bronze, worn smooth from years of use, a faded face, maybe Hadrian, maybe someone else, and a Latin inscription almost too faint to read. Cologne SPES. Hope. She held it to her lips, then buried it again, deeper this time, beneath a stone. Let someone else find it, she thought. Let someone remember we were here. The Empire did not return, but the Watchers did. Twice more in the following weeks. Once at dawn, once just before a storm. Never closer than the field, never farther than the woods. They stood, they watched. They left. And each time, the town felt smaller, like the walls were closing in, like the wind carried fewer names. But within the hollow shell of the village, life clung stubbornly to its corners. Licinia baked a guy. Not bread, there was no flour, but flat cakes made of crushed roots and dried berries. Bitter, but filling, she left them on doorsteps. The boys began leaving feathers in return. Alia drew birds in charcoal on the chapel walls. Petronius carved names into the forge's outer stones, tiny acts of resistance, or remembrance. It was hard to say which, and though they never said the words aloud, they all knew what was coming. One day, the men in the field would not turn back. One day, the watchers would become fire, but not today. Not yet. And so, Lucinia wrote once more, her ink running low, her hands trembling from the cold. If you find these pages, know that we tried. We stayed. We waited. We lit candles in the dark. Not for kings, not for gods, but for each other. And outside, the rain fell. Soft, relentless, washing the town into memory. The sky turned yellow the day the silence broke. It was the kind of light that didn't belong to any season. Heavy, strange, and thick like the air before a fever. The clouds sat low and unmoving, as if the heavens themselves were holding their breath. It was neither dawn nor dusk, but something in between, a hush of time suspended. Lucinia noticed it first through the cracks in the bakery shutters. A dull, golden sheen blanketing the town like a veil. It coated the stones, the trees, even the dust. She stood at the window, unmoving, the cold clay floor beneath her feet grounding her in the moment. The stillness was deeper than usual. No birds, no breeze, no voices, just light. By midday, the wind began. Not loud, not yet, but persistent. Low and slow, like a distant chant threading through the town's abandoned alleys. It brought with it a scent that turned the stomach. Smoke, sweat, metal, and the faintest trace of blood. Not fresh, not sharp. The old kind of blood, dried, worn into the grain of leather, soaked into cloth long buried. Lucinia did not speak. Didn't need to. The others felt it too. Petronius hammered once, then stopped. The boys didn't come out to play. Alia drew no birds that day. The chapel's doors remained closed. That evening, the watchers came closer. No longer a whisper on the edge of the forest, but a presence on the road. 5 figures, not 7, but nearer, closer than ever before. Then stopped. The boys didn't come out to play. Alia drew no birds that day. The chapel's doors remained closed. That evening, the watchers came closer. No longer a whisper on the edge of the forest, but a presence on the road. 5 figures, not 7, but nearer, closer than ever before. Their boots left deep, wet prints in the soft ground as they passed through the edge of the village. They didn't knock, didn't break anything. They didn't need to, they were only passing through, but they walked slowly, heads turning, eyes scanning. Not like invaders, not yet, but like men walking through a graveyard, reading names they didn't expect to find. Lucinia watched them from behind a curtain, her breath shallow, her heart pounding not with fear, but with fury. These were not Romans, not the sons of senators, or the armored protectors of the old law. They wore scraps of armor stitched with fur. Their speech, when one muttered to another, was rough, guttural, the language of the hills and forests, not of law or city stone. One of them, the tallest, paused near the bakery steps. She could see his breath in the cold air, see the wet glint of a blade at his side. See the way he looked up, right at the shuttered window, as if he knew she was there. Then he turned and walked on. By nightfall, they were gone, but their presence remained, like a handprint burned into the fabric of a dream. The next morning, the bakery door was ajar. Lucinia never left it open. She stepped cautiously inside, clutching her knife. The oven was cold. Nothing was missing, nothing taken, but on the counter, placed with deliberate care, sat a bundle of fresh garlic and a small sack of barley. She stared at it for a long time. An offering. A warning. She left it untouched. Petronius came by at noon, and they spoke in whispers. They'll be back, he said. Lucinia nodded. They haven't come to destroy us, she said quietly. Not yet. He looked at her for a long time, then turned away. No, he agreed, but they will. Not because they want to. Because they must. The empire was not falling anymore. It had fallen. And in its place, something else was rising. Not a kingdom. Not a nation. A hunger. And hunger has no map, no flag, no loyalty. It only knows where food still burns and where fires still glow. That night, the wind howled through the village like a voice returned. Doors creaked, shutters banged. In the chapel, Alia lit 3 candles and whispered the names of the saints, though no one remembered which ones still listened. The boys stayed close to Petronius. They no longer laughed. Lucinia stayed awake until dawn, quill in hand. There are no more legions, she wrote. No more governors, no grain ships, no rules, only stories. And those of us who still tell them. She paused, listening. Far off, so far she thought she imagined it, came the sound of hooves. Not one, not a few. Many. She stepped outside. The sky was still that strange yellow, like it hadn't moved since the day before. The road beyond the hill shimmered faintly, as if heat rose from it, but the air was cold. Her breath curled around her face, and her fingers ached from gripping the blade. Then she saw it, a plume of dust on the far edge of the plain. Not a storm. Riders. A caravan, perhaps, or a warband. It was too soon to tell, but it was moving toward them. She walked back into the bakery and began gathering the letters. Every page she had written. She didn't know if she'd survive the next night, or the one after, but the words, the record, might. She placed them all in a sack, tied it shut, and buried it beneath the HERTHSTONE. Just as the first clang of hooves echoed on stone. If you are reading this, we were the last of them, she wrote, hastily, on the final page. Not the heroes, not the rulers. Just the ones who stayed behind, who remembered, who watched the end. And then the door shook. A hand. A knock. Not a battering ram. Not yet. But an arrival. Licinia stood, her shawl wrapped tight, her feet bare on the cold stone. She walked to the door. The man at the door was not what she expected. No brute in blooded male. No ghost of empire. He was lean, weather-worn, with a face carved by wind and long travel, sharp around the eyes, mouth drawn tight as if he hadn't spoken aloud in weeks. His cloak was tattered at the edges, and what had once been a fine tunic was now a patchwork of stitching and dust. But his boots were clean, polished, the kind a soldier wears when the rest of him has forgotten how. Behind him, the others stood, 4 men, 1 woman, 2 children no older than the boys who now watched from behind Petronius's forge. They didn't speak, they didn't move. They simply waited, silent and hollow-eyed, like shadows spilled across the morning light. Licinia didn't flinch. She stepped aside. The man bowed slightly, just enough to show he remembered civility, and crossed the threshold with careful steps. He did not take his eyes off her, not even as he unfastened his satchel and knelt to remove something. A small leather pouch. A flask, a sealed scroll. He placed them on the counter gently, like relics, I was told. There was still bread here, he said at last, his voice hoarse. There was, Licinia answered. There might be again. The man nodded, but did not ask for food. Instead, he looked around the room, as if seeing a memory reborn. The stone oven, the soot-dark walls, the table carved with years of flour and fire. I remember the smell, he murmured. My mother was from Lucca, before the wars. She baked honey loaves on festival days. It's strange. What the body remembers, long after the mind forgets. Licinia said nothing, but her fingers brushed the old peel still leaning near the hearth, and for a moment, the warmth of that vanished world returned, flickering like a ghost in the smoke. Petronius entered, axe in hand. The man turned, raised both palms. No harm. No threat, he said quietly. We're not raiders. Petronius didn't lower the axe. Then what are you? He asked. Survivors. The word hung there. A confession. A plea. Behind him, the others remained outside, and sure whether to follow. One of the children, a girl with ash-colored hair and a frayed doll, looked up at the roof like she expected it to speak. Licinia stepped forward. You come with coin? She asked. The man shook his head. Then why should we give you shelter? His answer came slowly. Because we remember. He unrolled the scroll on the counter. It was brittle, marked with water and fire, but still legible. A decree, imperial, the wax seal broken, the name faded but still visible, Honorius, a relic of law. A voice from a dead throne. We were messengers, he said. Riders, carried news from Ravenna, before it Petronius fell. Blinked. Ravenna has fallen. The man nodded. Licia and I felt something tighten in her ribs, not panic, not even surprise. Just confirmation. The last thread had snapped. Rome had faded long ago. But Ravenna. Ravenna had been the last whisper of order, of walls, of names written in ledgers and soldiers who obeyed. What now? She asked softly. The man looked out the window. Now, there are only roads. The rain returned that evening, thin, cold, more mist than storm. But the wind that came with it was sharp and fast, like something broken open in the north had spilled down through the valleys. The newcomers stayed in the chapel. Aaliyah gave them her corner and slept beneath the altar. She hummed again that night, softer this time, like her breath might float away if she sang too loud. Petronius did not sleep. He sat at the forge, staring into coals that had long gone black. Licinia wrote. Her ink was almost gone. She thinned it with wine. They carry no fire, she wrote. But they carry memory, and that is almost as dangerous. The man, his name was Fabius, though he hadn't spoken it aloud until the third day, began repairing the shutters. Not because anyone asked him to, because he needed to do something with his hands. He used strips of bark and broken tools, not elegant, but useful. The boys watched him work. Then helped. By the week's end, the bakery had a door that no longer creaked. The forge had a dry roof, and the road. The road remained quiet, but not empty. They came in twos now. And threes. Not soldiers. Not warbands. Fragments. A widow and her dog. A crippled merchant dragging a cart of rusted tools. Two lovers who didn't speak the same language. Licinia stopped writing names. There were too many. Instead, she marked the days by sound. The crows, the rain, the knocking at dusk. One night, they burned a wagon, not as a warning, as a pyre. The merchant had died in his sleep, his hand still clutching a cracked amulet. No one knew his name, no one knew his god. But they gave him flame. And flame, in a world of rot and ruin, was still a kind of honor. The next morning, the girl with the doll left it on the chapel steps. A gesture, a gift, or a goodbye. Licinia picked it up, smoothed its hair, and placed it on the bakery shelf, beside the last jar of honey and the chipped cup with the crack through its rim. A museum, of sorts, a shrine to the ordinary. The world was smaller now, not poorer. Just quieter. The borders were gone, but there were still hearths, still doors, still eyes that watched the sky and remembered what stars once meant. Licinia wrote, "We are not Rome, we are not its shadow. We are the ones who stayed behind to watch the fire die and warm our hands on the last of its heat." The wind returned, but it no longer howled. It whispered. The seasons shifted without ceremony. No fanfare, no parade of color or sudden frost. Just the slow dimming of days and the hush that settles when the world prepares to sleep. Autumn crept in like a stray animal, cautious, lean, uninvited. The leaves browned, curled, and fell without applause. Even the trees seemed reluctant to let go. And still, they came, not in waves now, but in trickles. The people from the edge, from crumbled towns, from roads where milestones once stood like silent promises, from the places maps had stopped naming. Licinia no longer asked where they came from. Their eyes told enough, cracked lips, hollow cheeks, children with no words, elders with too many. Some brought stories, too worn to be useful. Others brought only silence, and that too was sacred. She listened anyway. One woman, old enough to have known the old currency, to remember the clink of bronze coins in amphora jars, said she once saw the emperor himself, not on a throne. Not in Rome. But in a garden, alone, digging. I thought it was a servant, she whispered. But someone called him Honorius. He was planting figs. She coughed and looked away. Maybe it was someone else. Licinia didn't correct her. Let the world remember its emperors as gardeners, if it must. There are worse legacies. The bakery became more than a place to eat. It was a center, a still point. When the rains came again, thicker this time, it became shelter. When the roads flooded and the wind screamed across the plain, it became a meeting place, a sanctuary for decisions spoken in low tones over chipped mugs and drying shoes. Petronius, who had once only watched, now spoke often. He knew how to lead, though he hated it. His voice was the kind that filled a space without crushing it, firm, slow, shaped by years of smoke and hammering. He kept count of what they had. 6 sacks of grain, 2 broken bows, a pile of clay tiles for the roof, and 1 good axe. When someone stole from the storehouse, he didn't shout. He gathered everyone by the hearth. "No walls," he said. "Not yet. That's not what will save us. What will save us is this, that we speak before we strike. That we share before we starve." No one confessed. But the food was returned the next morning, wrapped in linen, with a sprig of rosemary. Somewhere, an apology had taken root. Aaliyah, quiet, drifting Aaliyah, began painting again. She had nothing but crushed berries and soot, no parchment, so she used the walls. She painted birds first, flocks in flight, wings outstretched above the hearth. Then stars, then faces, not saints or gods. The faces of those who slept inside the bakery, their profiles cast in gentle strokes above the oven and the doorway. Licinia's was there to dot soft, solemn, watching the fire. She wept when she saw it, not from sorrow. From recognition. She had not realized she'd become someone worth remembering. On the 12th night of autumn, a child was born. A boy, red and screaming, born in the back room of the old smithy, beneath a roof patched with cloth and pine sap. The mother was a girl barely grown, perhaps 15, perhaps older. No one knew her name. She had arrived alone, barefoot, and in labor. Aaliyah and Licinia helped her, guided by memory more than skill. The baby emerged wailing, fists clenched, eyes tight against the cold world he'd fallen into. They named him Justice. No father claimed him, but everyone did. They wrapped him in a wool cloak donated by Fabius, fed the mother broth thickened with barley, and let the fire burn through the night. No one slept. They simply sat, watched, breathed. In a world coming and done, they had made something. The next morning, the sky was blue for the first time in weeks, clear, wide, and deep enough to make you forget how small the earth beneath your feet had become. Licinia stepped outside, squinting into the light. She hadn't noticed how hunched she'd become, how used to the dark. The sun didn't feel like it belonged anymore, but it was there, steady, and on the ridge, silhouetted against the sky, a figure stood. Alone, tall, still. She raised a hand. The figure did not move. She called out. No answer. Petronius joined her. His brow furrowed. Scout. He asked. Licinia shook her head. He's not watching. He's remembering. The figure turned. And walked away. Not a threat, not yet, but a sign. The world was not empty. It never had been. It was just breaking apart slower than they'd expected. And somewhere beyond the ridges, other fires were burning. Other people were remembering. Other voices were whispering in forgotten tongues. That night, Licinia wrote, "We are not what came before, but we are not nothing. We have breath, fire, birth, that is enough." She folded the page and placed it with the others. Then she lit a single candle. Held it up to the painted birds above the hearth. And whispered their names, one by one, into the darkness. The first snow came with no warning. No clouds, no wind, no scent in the air to herald its arrival. One evening the hills were brown and bare, and by morning the world had vanished under white. A silent burial, a clean slate. Children, unused to such stillness, woke with wide eyes and unsure hands, some reaching out to touch it, others shrinking away as if the snow might bite. It was cold, yes, but not cruel, not yet. It softened the edges of things. The ruined walls, the splintered carts, even the half-collapsed chapel, all covered now in a white hush that turned broken into beautiful. Licinia stood in the doorway of the bakery, hands wrapped around a warm clay cup, watching the flakes fall. They drifted slow, lazy, like they had all the time in the world. She thought of Rome. Not the empire. The city. She had been there once, when she was young, too young to remember details clearly, but old enough to recall impressions. The smell of bread in the streets, the laughter that echoed in wide marble halls, the statues that looked almost human, too grand to be gods, too perfect to be men. That Rome was just now. But this snowfall made her wonder if maybe the city hadn't disappeared. Maybe it had just scattered, like seeds. And maybe here, in this cold little valley, some part of it was starting to bloom again. The forge burned all day now. Petronius rarely left it, not because there was so much to make, but because people needed warmth, a reason to gather. And he gave it to them, wordlessly, by tending the fire. He carved wooden spoons for the children, sharpened blades that hadn't cut properly in years, hammered iron into nails, because someone had asked how to fix a door, and he couldn't stand to say we don't have the parts. He didn't speak much anymore, but when he did, people listened like they were hearing the last oak tree speak in a forest of rot. Aaliyah painted snowflakes onto the walls, small, delicate ones. Some were perfect circles, others jagged and strange. Each was different. She laughed when she explained that, the difference, and said, "That's the point, isn't it? If they were all the same, they'd melt faster." Licinia smiled at that. There were small things now, details, little rhythms that gave the days shape. Someone had begun reading aloud from old texts, half-burned scrolls, children's lessons, religious fragments no longer tied to gods but still thick with meaning. They sat in a circle, bundled close, and listened to the
Someone
words
else
like they
began
were
sewing,
being spoken
not
for
with
the
thread,
first time,
which had run out, but with strips of reed and lengths of bark.
Someone carved a flute. The sound it made wasn't quite music, but it was close enough to make someone cry. Fabius, ever the watchful one, taught the older boys to scout. Not to fight, not yet, but to notice, to move without sound. To observe how animals react before a storm. To read footprints in snow, especially the ones that aren't made by deer. He told them, the world isn't safer. But you can be wiser. They nodded, even when they didn't understand. They liked the weight of knowledge. It made them feel older than their bones. On the 7th night of snowfall, a fire was spotted on the ridge. It burned blue. High and strange, not from wood, not from hearth. Licinia and Petronius climbed the slope before dawn. Fabius followed, silent as breath. What they found was a cart. Shattered. Ashes. A man's body, half covered in snow, face burned beyond recognition, but his hands still gripped the reins. There were no animals left. No tracks leading away. No signs of struggle. Just one item left untouched. A wooden box, sealed tight with wax and rope. Petronius broke it open with the back of his axe. Inside were books. Dozens of them, wrapped in oilcloth, bound tight. Some were military records. Others were ledgers. But one, the one Licinia pulled from the bottom, was a collection of poems, Latin. Written with care. On the inside cover, a name, Serenus. Below it, the words, for those who will come after. Licinia held the book to her chest for a long time. They buried the man, gave him a name they invented on the spot, Custos, the keeper. It felt right. When they returned, they didn't speak of what they'd seen, but that night, Licinia read one of the poems aloud. The children didn't understand the language, not entirely, but they listened, quiet and still, as if the words were made of wind and moonlight. And when she was finished, one of the boys whispered, "Can you read it again?" She did. Twice. Until his eyes closed, and the candle beside her burned low. The snow felt thicker after that, covered the windows, pressed at the door. Still. They stayed warm. Still, they spoke. Still, they dreamed. Licinia wrote, "We are the unread pages, the quiet chapter. But we are here, still inked, still breathing, and perhaps that is enough." Outside, the stars returned, clearer now. Closer. As if the sky had lowered itself just enough. The wind had a voice now. It moaned low through the shutters and curled beneath the eaves like a wounded thing searching for comfort. Some nights, it sounded almost human, like a name half remembered or a prayer too old to be spoken aloud. Those who were young clung to blankets. Those who were old clung to silence. Winter had settled deep in the bones of the valley. Not just a season now, but a presence, a weight. It touched everything. Turned breath to mist, turned water to glass, turned the world inward. Inside the bakery, the fire never went out. They kept it alive with scrap wood, broken carts, old beams from crumbling barns. Even furniture, when it came to it, no one complained. A chair was worth less than warmth, a table, less than sleep, and they slept together now. Tighter, closer, whole families beneath a single quilt. The crackle of fire their lullaby, the slow, patient sound of breath like waves in a tide that no longer reached the sea. Licinia had taken to writing less. There were no more candles to spare, but she remembered the words in her chest, repeated them softly in her head, carving them into memory like stone. There is a kind of scripture that needs no ink. They had not seen travelers in weeks. The roads were gone, swallowed by drifts, erased like chalk beneath snow. Even the animals had retreated. The valley became a closed world, suspended in ice. But time moved. In the children's limbs that grew longer. In the weary strength that settled behind tired eyes. In the way they stopped asking when spring would come. And Justice, the child born beneath the storm, now cooed and reached for faces with hands still too small to grasp the world. He grew quickly, as if the cold had no hold on him. As if something in him refused to be still. One night, Aaliyah painted the boy's hands in soot and pressed them against the wall beside the hearth. 5 tiny prints. Black and smudged. A mark of presence. Proof. That same night, Fabius returned from his watch with a story. "There's smoke," he said. To the west, 3 plumes, campfires. Petronius asked. Too small. Not enough to warm a crowd. Scouts. Then, Fabius hesitated. Or survivors. Silence filled the room like snow falling in a forest. No one moved. No one spoke, until the baker's daughter, a girl of maybe 10, said, "Maybe they're like us." And just like that, the fear softened. Not gone, but quieter. That night, Licinia dreamed of her mother, a woman with flour on her hands and a voice like linen, soft, worn, comforting. In the dream, she wasn't in Rome or in a villa. She was here, in the bakery, tending the fire. She turned to Licinia and said only, "It matters that you stayed." When Licinia woke, the words clung to her like heat. The next day, they prepared, not for war, but for company. They cleared space, baked extra bread, boiled herbs into teas that smelled of memory, repaired the torn curtain near the entrance, sewed it by hand with pine needles and wool thread made from unraveling cloaks. No one said it out loud, not even Petronius, but they all hoped. Not for salvation, but for proof that somewhere beyond the snow, the world still moved, that they were not alone. 3 days passed. No visitors came. And then, on the fourth night, when the wind had stilled and the fire crackled in a hush too perfect to last, there was a knock. Not loud. Not desperate. Just a sound, a shape against silence. Fabius opened the door with a hand on his blade. Beyond it stood a boy, no older than 16, wrapped in rags. His lips were blue, and his fingers too stiff to hold the wooden token he tried to offer. He said nothing. He just looked at them, eyes wide with the kind of exhaustion that belongs to people who have seen the edge of the world and chosen to walk back from it. Licinia stepped forward, took his hand, led him in. The others followed, for more, all young. 2 girls, 1 older woman, and a man with a crooked gait and a face lined like old bark. They said little. Just names, nods. One whispered, "We thought we were the only ones." Licinia nodded. So did we. That night, they didn't sleep. They sang. Not songs of empire or saints. Just voices. Layered, off-key, low and tired and real. It wasn't beautiful, but it was alive. And that was enough. Licinia wrote nothing that night. She just listened. To the breathing. To the laughter. To the slow return of something that had no word anymore. Not hope. Not peace. Something older. Something quieter. Outside. The stars blinked slowly through the frost-heavy clouds, and the valley, forgotten, broken, buried beneath history, whispered back to the sky. The thaw began not with sunlight, but with sound. A slow drip from the eaves. A trickle under the door. The gentle groan of snow shifting on the rooftops. The valley exhaled, not all at once, but in breaths, like a sleeper waking from a long, frozen dream. It was still cold, still cruel in its quiet way. But something had shifted. You could smell the earth again. At first, they didn't believe it. The children ran outside with bare hands, touching the muddy patches like they were wounds healing on the skin of the world. One of the boys, a lean thing named Naso with a chipped tooth and a laugh too loud for winter, yelled into the woods just to hear his voice bounce back. Even the trees looked different now, no longer skeletons, but watchers. Holding buds like secrets, Licinia stood beside Petronius and said, "It's too soon." He nodded. Too soon, he agreed. But not too late. Inside, the newcomers had begun to speak. Not just names now, but stories. Their road had been long, winding from the edge of what had once been Gaul, through shattered towns, past burned villages and bridges choked with bodies. They had slept in cellars, in barns, in empty temples with broken altars. They had seen men hanging from trees with signs nailed to their chests. Traitor, thief, pagan, Christian, words that no longer meant anything but still killed all the same. One girl, Livia, had been a scribe's daughter. She still had ink on her nails, even after months on the road. She carried nothing but a single page of Virgil's Georgics, carefully rolled in cloth and tucked beneath her tunic like a heart. She recited it one night, quietly, whispered. The valley listened. A few wept. Not because they knew the words, but because someone still did. That was the turning. Not the snowmelt. Not the warmth, but the memory that there had been beauty. That someone had bothered to carry it through fire. That someone still knew how to speak it aloud. The forge came alive again. Petronius worked with a kind of reverence now. Not hurried, not desperate, deliberate. Every nail hammered with care. Every blade sharpened like it might plant a field rather than take a life. Fabius taught the older boys how to trap. The newer ones were quick to learn. They asked smart questions, shared food without being told. One of them, Calidus, a boy with one eye clouded from fever, had once served with a comitatence's unit before it fell apart outside Lugdenham. He knew more than he let on. He was quiet and polite, and smiled like someone who had lost brothers. He and Fabius walked the ridge, watching not for enemies, but for signs. Smoke, movement, birds fleeing all at once. Each time they returned without incident. The bakery exhaled. Every time, the hope grew a little heavier. One morning, they found footprints. Large, deep, recent. Too wide for deer, too long for wolves. Petronius crouched beside them, pressing his palm into the nearest one. His fingers didn't span the width. Fabius said, "How many?" Petronius looked up. Enough. Double quotes. They didn't panic. They prepared. Quietly. With the same calm they used to mend shoes or stir soup. They checked the doors, the shutters, hid the children beneath the bakery's floor, a shallow root cellar with barely enough room to breathe. Lacinia read aloud that night, even as her hands trembled. She chose a passage from the Georgics about planting olive trees in the ruins of old battlefields. No one spoke of the prince again, not out loud. But something in them shifted. A new kind of silence took root. Not fear, not exactly. A waiting. One of the old women began spinning yarn again, using flax from a long-forgotten bundle found buried beneath the floorboards of the chapel. She hummed as she worked. Her hands were cracked, her voice thinner than it once was, but she hummed anyway. She said, "When the wolves are close, I sing louder," and so they did. They sang. Not often, not in unison, not well. But sometimes, when the night was deep and the wind still, you could hear them, soft voices echoing off stone and snow, weaving through the rafters like smoke. It wasn't hope. Not really. It was something quieter, something older. The knowing that even if the world ended again tomorrow, tonight, just tonight, they had filled the silence. Lacinia began writing again. Scraps at first. Notes on the backs of burned ledgers, words tucked between the margins of old scrolls. She didn't write for memory anymore. Or legacy. She wrote because it made her feel like she was still inside the world. She wrote, "The snow is melting. Not all at once, but enough to know the sky remembers us. The children still laugh. Their teeth shine like coins no emperor could ever mint. We are not waiting for Rome to return. We are building something new in the cracks." And she meant it, because for the first time in a long time, there was more to life than surviving. There was living, and with living came risk, but also wonder. The bakery door remained open the next morning. A fire on the hearth, bread rising in the heat, and above the door, hung by a single nail, was a strip of bark with one word carved into it. The rain came before dawn. Not the soft kind that kissed the soil, but the old rain, heavy, insistent, full of memory. It drummed on the roof like footsteps overhead and soaked through the shutters until the walls bled cold. It smelled of ash and iron, of the things buried and the things returned. In the silence between the drops, you could almost hear it say, "It's not over yet." Inside, no one spoke. Not at first. They listened. To the rhythm of it. To the way it crept into their bones like an old habit. Lacinia stood near the window with a shawl drawn over her shoulders. The glass was smeared with condensation, but she could just make out the dark line of trees in the distance. Black, swaying, whispering. Fabius was already gone. Out on watch. He never waited for dawn anymore. The others stirred slowly, one by one, as if waking not from sleep, but from a spell. There was a hush in the bakery, like the breath before a scream, or the pause before lightning. And then the knock came. 3 raps. Measured. Unhurried. Not the desperate pounding of the starving. Not the wild clamor of bandits. Just a knock. Petronius opened the door with one hand on the iron poker he now kept behind the crates of flour. On the other side stood a man. Alone. Unarmed. Or perhaps just too wet to care. He was older, maybe 50, though age meant little now. His cloak was torn at the shoulder, and his left eye was milk-white and unmoving. But he stood with a posture that had once known command. He said, simply, "I bring word. Not I bring help. Not I need shelter. Just that. A courier of fate." He gave no name, but sat by the fire with his palms turned to the heat, and told them what he'd seen. Rome was gone, he said. Not the city, the illusion. Gone not in a single moment, but in thousands of quiet failures. Gone like a candle guttering out after too many nights of smoke. He spoke of lands divided, not conquered, just abandoned. Walls built between neighbors. Towns ruled by local warlords who called themselves dukes or prefects but bowed to no emperor. He spoke of Visigoths setting up courts in Gaul, and Vandals turning North Africa into a kingdom of their own. Of imperial officials who still wore togas and gave orders, even as rats nested in the Senate halls and statues crumbled in the gardens. There are still people calling themselves Romans, but none of them are looking up anymore. He reached into his satchel and placed something on the table, a coin, bronze, worn smooth. The face of a boy emperor on one side, too young to rule. A broken eagle on the other. No one touched it. It looked like a relic from another world. And maybe it was. The man stayed for 2 nights. Slept by the hearth, ate little, spoke less, and when he left, he took nothing. Not even the coin. Licinia asked him, before he disappeared down the slope, "Why do you keep walking?" He looked back with something between a smile and a wince. "Because there are stories left to deliver," he said. "And people still listening." Then he was gone. The rain kept falling for 3 more days. And with it came a different kind of quiet. Not dread, not grief, but clarity. There was no empire to save. No city to return to. No dream to mourn. Only this, a bakery in a valley, a fire, and the soft breath of people who still chose to wake each morning. It was enough. One morning, Petronius took down the rusted sword he had once worn during his service in the legion. He ran a whetstone over it slowly, once, twice. Then he placed it on the table, wrapped it in wool, and buried it in the garden. No one asked why. No one needed to. Weapons had their time. So did silence. That night, Licinia read again. Her voice was softer now, not from fear, but from reverence. She read from the old books, but also her own writings, fragments, lines half finished, thoughts caught between the days. She read, "What is Rome, if not a story we told ourselves to feel less alone? We are not ruins or seeds, buried but waiting. The empire may have fallen, but kindness remains." The children asked her to read more. And when she finally closed the scroll, the girl named Livia, the one who had carried the Georgics, offered her a page. A fresh one. Blank. Not for memory. Not for history. But for now. For the bread rising in the hearth. For the rain sliding down the stones. For the warmth in their chests that refused to go out. Licinia dipped her quill. And began again. The fog rolled in before morning, thick and low, curling through the trees like it had a mind of its own. It muffled sound. It stole shapes. The bakery, once a warm pulse in the dark valley, now felt like an island adrift in smoke. They moved carefully in it, quietly, even the children. It wasn't fear, exactly. It was respect. For the stillness, for the idea that something ancient might be watching from within it. Petronius said the fog reminded him of battle. Of marching at dawn when your hands still ached from the cold, and the enemy was somewhere nearby, unseen, but real. He didn't say it with pride, only memory, like an old song you no longer sang but still knew the tune to. By noon, the fog hadn't lifted. Fabius returned from the ridge with a strange look in his eyes. He said, "They're coming," and everyone understood. Not who. Not why. Just they. Strangers. Not necessarily enemies. But not friends either, not yet. People, perhaps, like themselves. Fleeing one end of the world, hoping for something at the other. There were 30 of them, maybe more. Shapes in the mist, not marching, limping. Some carried bundles, others carried one another. No banners, no wagons, just people, tired, hollowed out, drifting through the last breath of the empire like ghosts. And then they stopped, just outside the tree line. No one moved. From the bakery window, Licinia watched the standoff unfold. No words, just silence. A long, aching pause where 2 groups of survivors stared at one another across the invisible border between what was safe and what was not yet known. Then movement. A girl stepped forward. Couldn't have been older than 12. Her dress torn at the hem, her face hidden beneath a shawl. She held something in both hands and walked slowly toward the edge of the village. Fabius raised his hand, not to stop her, but to prepare for anything. Petronius stood behind him, breathing like a man holding back the tide. Fabius raised his hand, not to stop her, but to prepare for anything. Petronius stood behind him, breathing like a man holding back the tide. But the girl didn't falter. She walked until she reached the road, then knelt, and placed the object on the stones, a loaf of bread, wrapped in cloth. Still warm. Then she turned and walked back into the mist. They didn't follow, not right away. but something in that gesture unraveled the tension like a thread. That night, the villagers talked long after the fire burned low. What should they do? How many could they feed? Would it draw attention, make them vulnerable? Licinnia listened to it all, every fear, every doubt. She said little, but later, when the voices had dimmed and the children had curled against each other like sleeping birds, she stepped out into the fog herself. She walked until the air turned cold again, until the trees whispered above her, until she saw the first faint glimmer of a fire in the distance, and there, sitting in silence, were the newcomers. Watching, waiting. She approached the girl, slowly, hands open, and she said, "What's your name?" The girl hesitated, then answered, "I don't remember." Licinnia nodded, not surprised. "Would you like another?" The girl tilted her head, confused. "A name," Licinnia clarified. "We give them here." "Sometimes the old ones are too heavy." The girl thought a moment, then said, "Yes." Licinnia reached out, gently brushing a wet strand of hair from the child's brow. "Then let's find one together." The next morning, the mist was gone, the sun didn't shine, but the sky lightened, enough to see the shapes that now moved along the path into the village. A line of travelers. Faces drawn, clothes soaked, feet blistered. And doors began to open. Not all. Not at once, but one by one. Someone offered a blanket. Another broth, steaming in a cracked clay bowl. No one spoke of Rome. No one asked where they'd come from. It didn't matter anymore. The empire had ended long ago, but something else had begun. Small. Quiet. Human. The bakery filled again. With noise, with breath, with life. Livia taught the newcomers how to knead dough. Fabius taught them where the traps were set. Licinnia taught them how to listen, to the wind, to the soil, to the ache in their own chests. And the girl, the one without a name. She chose one, not Roman. Not Greek. Just Alba, meaning dawn. Because, as she said with a rare, trembling smile, it sounds like the first thing that comes after dark. And no one disagreed. That night, there was music. Not much, just a reed flute someone had carried since the Black Forest, and a cracked drum that had once been a grain pot. But it was enough. They danced. Badly, softly, like they were still learning what joy felt like. And when they finally rested, tired, breathless, warm from the fire and from each other, Licinnia wrote only one line before falling asleep by the hearth. It happened slowly, like the way winter slips into spring, not with trumpets, but with thaw. With the drip of melting ice, with the green shoot daring its way through dead leaves. No proclamation was made, no flags unfurled. But everyone felt it, in the marrow of their days. Something had shifted. Time no longer circled around the memory of Rome. It moved forward now, drawn by the hands of those still willing to build. The bakery became more than a bakery. It became a school, a meeting place, a shelter. The walls expanded, patched together with salvaged timber and bricks from forgotten villas. Each layer told a story of scavenged hope, of quiet craftsmanship, of belonging not to a nation, but to each other. They called the place Nova Terra. New Earth, not because they believed the land was new, but because they were. People came in waves now. Some for bread, some for rest. Some stayed for a night and vanished by dawn. Others lingered, built, became. Names changed, borders blurred. A man who once marched under the eagle now taught children how to mend fishing nets. A woman who had lost 3 sons to the wars became the village's midwife, delivering life with hands that had once buried the dead. They buried fewer now. Fabius no longer walked the ridge each morning with a spear. Instead, he carved tools. He laughed more. Licinnia, older now, moved more slowly. Her hair fully silver, her hands spotted with time. But her voice had only grown stronger. She read aloud each evening, her voice echoing off the warm stone walls. The stories had changed, too. Not just Virgil and Tacitus. Now there were tales of Alba and her garden of colored beans, grown from seeds carried across entire continents. Of Livia, who could name every bird by its song. Of the winter the wolves came, and Petronius stared one down until it turned back into the forest. Of the fire that nearly took the granary, and the bucket chain that rose like a heartbeat. Saving what mattered most, Licinnia wrote it all down. Scroll after scroll, tied with string, kept in clay jars beneath the hearth. Not because she thought anyone would come looking for them, but because the stories mattered, because they were proof that they were here, that this was Rome now, not marble columns and slave-run estates, but shared meals and kindness passed in whispers. One evening, a traveler arrived from the east, dusty, sunburned, worn to the bone. He sat quietly as Licinia read from a new scroll, her voice rising and falling like wine through reeds. When she finished, he said nothing for a long time. Then finally, "I thought Rome had died." She smiled. "Tired,
It did,"
but bright," she said. "But not the part that mattered." He stayed the night, and by morning, was fixing the west wall with clay and straw. The years went on. Children grew, trees thickened, old scars healed, the scrolls multiplied, and then, as gently as she had lived, Licinia passed. No grand moment. No final words, just sleep. And then quiet. They buried her in the orchard, beneath the fig tree she had planted herself, the one that had only started bearing fruit the year before. The village stood silent for a long time after. Alba, now grown, placed one of Licinia's quills at the base of the tree, not for memory, but for roots. They kept reading her stories, every night, even long after her voice was gone. And somewhere, miles beyond the valley, someone else took up ink and parchment, and wrote, "This is the story of those who came after the empire. Not conquerors, not kings, just people. Weary, patient, brave. They built warmth from rubble, bread from dust, a world from the bones of another, and in the quiet, they endured. If you're still here, still listening, thank you. Dim the lights if you haven't already. Let the silence settle softly around you now. And when you sleep, sleep gently. Because even in endings, there are seeds. And somewhere, in some forgotten corner of time, Rome still breathes. If you've made it this far, thank you, truly. I hope this journey through shadows and silence gave you a moment of peace, a glimpse of the human spirit still flickering even in the darkest hours of history. If this story helped you unwind, or made you feel a little less alone tonight, consider leaving a quiet comment. Let me know where you're listening from, what time it is, or even just how you're feeling. I read everyone, and it's always comforting to see how many of us are drifting off under the same sky, even from different corners of the world. And if you'd like more calm stories like this, softly told, slowly unfolding, feel free to subscribe. It helps the channel reach more people who might need a bit of rest tonight. Until next time, keep the fire warm, tread gently through the ruins, and remember, not all empires are made of stone, some are made of stories.